Hey there. It is the Rye Historical Society's Happy Hour History reading. I'm Debbi Toohey, and I'm reading from my little bit dark fall reading area. And we are starting with Chapter 2 of Just Rye Harbor, continuation. The book is written in appreciation and history, and it's written by Thomas C. and Rosemary F. Clarie. And it's just very exciting to be knowing that the dredging of the harbor is going on in November, and here we are reading about the Rye Harbor. So Chapter 2 starts, the title being The Battle of Rye Harbor, May 30th, 1814. I see a friend from Orlando checking in, so that's kind of fun. Hello. Along the New Hampshire seacoast, one can see Revolutionary War era Fort Constitution in Newcastle, Civil War era Fort McClary in Kittery, First World War era Forts Stark in Newcastle and Foster in Kittery Point, and Second World War Fort Dearborn at Odierne Point in Rye. None of these saw action in a naval battle, but Rye Harbor did. Eva Spear in New Hampshire's historic coast calls it the only naval fight on the coast of New Hampshire. At the 1812 town meeting, the voters of Rye directed the selectmen to authorize Colonel Goss, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, to issue a good firearm, 1/2 pound powder, and balls in proportion, to men able to fight in defense of their country. The following year, Rye purchased another 100 pounds of powder and lead, which it stored at the meeting house in Rye Center, plus 2 cannon, which it stationed out front. On April 5th in 1814, the British warships Juan and Tenedos were reported in the area off the coast of Salem, Massachusetts. The citizens, afraid of a British landing, appealed to Governor Gillem for protection. On May 20th, he responded by reinforcing the forts and posting garrisons at the Plains, now the Portsmouth Little League ball field where President Washington was welcomed to the city in 1789, and at the South Rope Walk to guard against an attack from forces landing at Hampton or in Rye. The townspeople's worst fears were confirmed on May 29, 1814, when the Juan and the Tenedos appeared outside of Rye Harbor on what has ever been known since as Gunboat Shoal, now marked by a green bell buoy about a mile offshore to the northeast. This was part of British efforts to enforce the blockade of all U.S. ports that the British Admiralty had declared during the War of 1812. And I am going to have a sip. I have not had enough water today, so unfortunately I'm starting with water. But you may have a sip of your cocktail because it is happy hour history. A schooner entered the mouth of the harbor with a barge from one of the British ships in close pursuit. Writes Emma Kimball in her research notes at the New Hampshire Historical Society, the signal to enter the harbor was given to the vessel by William Matthews and Robinson Foss, who in a boat called a punt were fishing outside the harbor, and who swung their hats to the men on board, who followed them, thus escaping from the British ships. While tying their boat at the northern side of Ragged Neck, Matthews and Foss heard the balls fly from the barge. General Goss had posted his men on both sides of the harbor entrance, behind the fish houses and stone walls at Little Neck and Ragged Neck. One of Rye's residents, Mr. Mao, who lived on Little Neck, hailed the barge as it entered the harbor, drawing a volley of small arms fire from the barge's crew. He then shot back, and the men behind the wall and fish houses responded to the shots of the British with so much enthusiasm that many ran out of the entire 16 to 18 rounds supplied to them by the town. The meeting house bell sounded the alarm, and rumors of the enemy's landing brought terror into the hearts of many Rye citizens. Great dread and excitement spread throughout the town. Many people packed their possessions, ready to flee into the interior. Goss sent his son, William, and William Verrill to the town center to fetch the 2 cannon. But as the horses started out on a run down Meeting House Hill, the bottom of the ammunition box fell out, letting loose the balls. This would have been on Central Road, just in front of the cemetery. The misfortune delayed the impatient drivers long enough for them to miss their chance to really frighten the British. Mrs. Jonathan Brown hurriedly packed her best feather bed into her coach and set off for her children for the home of relatives in Northampton, experiencing a near collision trying to pass a fleeing neighbor on the single-lane Grove Road. Neither of them spoke a word in the dark as they untangled their coaches. Dr. John W. Parsons gathered his instruments and bandages and left his Rye Center residence on horseback for the battle site. His son, Thomas J. Parsons, and nephew Isaac D. Parsons ran nonstop until they reached the salt marsh at the harbor, from where they watched the barges firing. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And if you're a little bit late joining in, we're on Chapter 2 of Just Rye Harbor, and we're reading about the Battle of Rye Harbor. Hundreds of people, including some from Portsmouth, crowded the shores to watch the battle unfold, carefully staying just beyond the range of the guns. Schooners could move only a few knots, so the slow pace of the prelude to the battle allowed plenty of time for folks to get there in time. Ragged Neck, where the state park on the north side of the harbor, was filled with fish houses at the time. Word was sent to Portsmouth of the impending invasion, and the company commanded by Captain Joshua W. Pierce started from Portsmouth to Rye Harbor. They were met on the way by a messenger who reported that the enemy had been driven off. The company turned back. In the exchange of gunfire, the barge's coxswain fell to the deck. It was not clear whether he was dead. Several barge crewmen were wounded before they turned about and returned to their mother ships, which soon sailed away. Not one was injured on the American side. Following the Battle of Rye Harbor, the entire coastline was reinforced, but this was the only encounter with the British or any other attacker in the history of the New Hampshire coast. During the War of 1812, some Rye men risked their lives running the British blockade. In one incident, Captain Henry Trefethen was bringing his small Portsmouth fishing smack, Yankee, home from a Gloucester to Portsmouth trip to pick up oak knees. He came upon a blockading ship anchored in the fog. Writes the historian William Saltston in Ports of Piscataqua, the wind was light, but the schooner, hailed by the ship, went on into the mist. A moment later, the warship fired a broadside in the general direction of the Yankee. It completely riddled her foresail, cut up the jib, and splintered the main boom. Captain Trefethen pressed on, however, and as the fog burned off, he took refuge in Rye Harbor. John W. Parsons of Rye sailed from Cape Ann in early December 1814 as surgeon aboard the armed ship Orlando. Ironic, because that's where I used to live. When the vessel returned after capturing several prizes, Parsons joyfully spread the news that the war between the United States and Great Britain was over. Some Rye privateers had less success and were captured. Parsons, in his history, reports that Richard Rand Locke and Jonathan Goss sailed from Portsmouth in the privateer Thomas and were captured by a British frigate and taken to Halifax, then sent to England and imprisoned in Dartmoor prison. Lock was a prisoner there for 1 year and 9 months, while Goss died in prison of smallpox. Another Rye resident, Robert Robinson, was also imprisoned in Dartmoor. Thomas Green and Samuel Caswell of Rye sailed from Portsmouth in December of 1814 on the armed ship Portsmouth, which historian Parsons calls one of the largest and finest privateers that ever left Portsmouth Harbor. He concludes, many other residents of Rye sailed in privateers during this war, but of course no record of this irregular service was kept. And that concludes chapter 2. Because it's a short chapter, I'm going to go on and read chapter 3, which entails the years of 1820 to 1850, and it's entitled Rye Harbor as a Busy Port. But first, I'm going to have a sip, and so should you. Excuse me. During the 1800s, fairly large schooners could easily enter at high water and conduct business at 2 wharves. Hi, welcome for joining us. I see some new people on. Conducting business at 2 wharves. Several fish houses were erected on the shores of the harbor, and boats were very busy in the summer catching, salting, drying, and shipping the fish to different markets. In the fall and winter, the fishing boats carried farm products to Boston, as well as much of the fish cured at Gosport on the Isles of Shoals. They brought back from the city groceries for their homes in Rye. Wood drawn by oxen through an old cart path north of the highway, which had not then been laid out, was also taken to the islands. Vessels were frequently loaded with potatoes, which was Rye's chief export. Writes William Verrill in Rye on the Rocks, it is recorded in an 1823 New Hampshire Gazetteer that in the fall of the year, farmers with their carts waiting to load their product onto a carrier might be seen lining the roads as far in distance from the harbor. Emma Kimball writes, about the year 1835, according to the best recollection of Mr. Levi Brown, his father, Captain James Brown, with his nephew, Jonathan Brown, as mate, went to Boston in the Hero, laden with potatoes and other produce. Finding the market dull, Captain Brown sent home his mate while he remained to sell the cargo. One night, while resting in his berth, a man boarded the vessel and went down the hatchway to rob the captain, who had no idea of lamely submitting and fought desperately for his life. There's a hand-drawn map of Rye in 1851 from the Parsons History of Rye, which I'll show you, but I don't think you're going to really be able to see the detail very well, but I will show it to you nonetheless. Kimball goes on, the robber beat him with a spoke, then seizing a hatchet, cut him badly about the head, hands, and arms, but was frightened away before he had killed the captain or obtained his money. Captain Brown was taken to the Chelsea Hospital, where he remained a long time. He never wholly recovered the use of his right hand. There was great excitement over the affair, and the citizens of Boston gave him a liberal subscription. The robber was from Newburyport and of foreign birth. He was arrested after an exciting search, tried, and imprisoned in Charlestown, where he died before the expiration of his sentence. Elihu, the son of Captain James Brown, later took over command of the Hero from his father until 1857, when Captain Dearborn Lock bought and commanded it. Researcher Kimball then documents some of the trade carried out of Rye Harbor during that period. Ivory Brown, son of Captain John Brown, was part owner of the schooner Two Brothers from 1836 to 1840. On April 1 of 1836, 528 bushels of potatoes were taken aboard from the 10 local farmers. On April 18th, 542 bushels were taken on board. On April 28th, 458 bushels. In May, 494 bushels, and on June 13th, 285 bushels. All of these were from rye farmers, except for several hundred bushels from one of the lampreys of Little River. On one potato voyage, the Fly brought back from Boston 11 barrels of flour for different families, 46 gallons of molasses, and various shovels. Another brought back salt, 10 pounds of candy, 6 plow points, 2 bottles of Abbott's bitters, 1 bushel of corn, some lemons, 1 bushel of beans, hogsheads of molasses, books, hoes, shovels, and Bibles. These were sent back in exchange for potatoes, eggs, and fish. Long reds, whitebacks, and shenanigans appear to have been the varieties favored for the potato trade, with haddock and cod, the fish most in demand. Other Rye Harbor vessels of the period included the John Brooks, commanded by Captain Gardner Lock, also master at one time of the Two Brothers when it was owned by Oliver Philbrook and Ivory Brown. The schooner Nancy and Victor, under Master Carr Levitt, the schooner Register, under owner and master Richard Locke, the schooner Sarah, under Captain William Verrill, the schooner Echo, under Captain Daniel Lord, the schooner Globe, under Captain Gardner T Lock, and the schooner Otis, under Captain William Goss. Other noteworthy schooners that sailed out of Rye Harbor were Eagle, Tyro, Four Brothers, and Mary Jane, along with the sloop Freedom. Emma Kimball describes the largest vessel as being the Tabithia, a 36-ton topsail schooner built in 1818 in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. The vessel was later owned by Thomas J. Parsons, Jesse Philbrook, and Oliver Philbrook, with Jesse as captain. Carrying a load of lumber and bound for Hampton in 1845, the Tabithia hit rocks and was beached in Little Harbor. Oliver was well remembered as having been coxswain of the market boat, which pulled back and forth between the Navy Yard and this city, being Portsmouth, before a steamer was put on to do the work. Captain Jesse Philbrook commanded her, and she was the first vessel to bring a load of oysters to this port, taking them from Wellfleet, Massachusetts, when they had been bedded. Author William Verrill documents another local voyage with information taken from the journal of William Chauncey Walker. The year 1848 was a memorable one from the fact that I went to Boston on the schooner John Brooks, which Parsons reports cost $650 to build. Gardner T Lock master, Jonathan Dearborn Lock, and Joseph Berry crew. It was in May, and the cargo was potatoes. I had to Cox, I think a long time before my parents would consent for my taking the trip, but I had been told by other boys who had taken the trip what a fine thing it was, and I finally got permission. I was at the time 15 years old. The journal continues. I only remember distinctly one incident of the voyage. It was before rounding Cape Ann, and Captain Dearborn, who was at the tiller, wanted to go below for his pipe or something. And giving me instructions to keep the prow to a certain point, left me in charge of the ship. Somehow or other, I failed to keep her right, And as near as I can remember, the sail began to flap, and it wasn't long before Captain was aft again and took command. I know the vessel arrived in Boston Harbor at night and was finally made fast to a wharf near the foot of Quincy Market. Continues William Chauncey Walker. After getting securely fastened to the wharf, the first object of interest I wanted to see was Bunker Hill Monument in Charleston. I went to the Boston Museum and saw the play Moll Pitcher. I also went to the old Federal Street Theater one night. I was in the gallery and it cost 12 cents to get there. Captain G.L. found a market for his potatoes at the House of Correction, South Boston, so he pulled out and made for that place where the vessel was unloaded and then back to Boston. Walker came home from that trip by rail, which cost him 50 cents. Sometime around 1850, he helped his father build the Sandy Beach Road home of Robert W. Verrill, who was William Verrill's great-grandfather. After finishing the Verrill house, William Walker took a second trip to Boston and stayed with cabinet maker Oscar Maths, who was William Verrill's great-grandmother's brother. In the 1850s, a quarter of Rye's population was dependent on fishing, but by the latter part of the 19th century, the town's economy became increasingly reliant on tourism. And as we all know, that was the beginning of the Victorian tourism trade, and many of the guest homes and boarding houses, and if you've tuned in for other readings from a couple of the other books, you will know that the fishermen, the farmers, at this time in the middle 19th century, as people started coming here, would take folks in to board, and eventually they saw that what they needed to do was either create more rooms in their places or start building hotels, guest houses, because, as we just read, the town's economy became more reliant on tourism, and they were smart to take advantage of that. And that concludes chapters 2 and 3 of Just Rye Harbor. There is a picture here that I will share with you that shows, I will read the caption to you. It's the cable coming ashore at Rye in 1874 in the Harper's Weekly magazine, because chapter number 4 is about the cable, and that is the Atlantic cable that was situated here in Rye at the end of the 19th century, and that's very exciting. So tune in next week to find out about the cable arrival, and I know that chapter's longer, otherwise I would start that. Yeah, no, it's much longer. So that concludes tonight's Happy History Hour with the Rye Historical Society, and it gives me great pleasure to have read with you tonight, to have folks watching. And we know in today's world that some of those boats in today's world would maybe have a female captaining them, and I just mentioned that because we now have in front of us our first female vice president in line to take office in January. And that's very historic, and I mention it because we are living history here today, in this century, in this year, and in next year. So stay well, stay healthy, enjoy the rest of your happy hour, stay warm, and we'll see you next week with another reading, another chapter from Just Rye Harbor. This is Debbi Toohey saying thanks for joining me. Have a great week, and we will see you later. Good night.